Let's have a look at a few lines that we haven't seen yet of the Italian opening, how to beat the Italian. So we're playing f5, right? We're beating the Italian with the Rousseau Gambit. So let's start with d3, right? We've seen this move extensively, but after knight f6, bishop g5, we know we attack the bishop. And after, we're going to look at two options here that we haven't seen at all throughout the entire saga. One of them, bishop e3, bishop back, which is obviously not good. But the other one is bishop takes, queen takes. We've seen this before. And now knight to c3, as we know, we go pin the knight. We're going to take the knight, and then we're going to take the pawn in e4 and isolate and double up the pawn, the c pawns. So here, white, let's say castles, take, 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 take. And now d6, and we've created the weakness. Now, we went through queen d5 now, in the video number 3 of the saga. We're going to go through bishop d5 this time. And also, instead of bishop d5, a4. This is another idea. So let's see, bishop d5 now. So you play knight e7 now to attack the bishop, bishop to b3, and now bishop to g4. You're completely winning already because the bishop here is unable to go and help the defense of this knight. You're gonna double up these pawns. You also, you're pinning it. You're pinning the knight, so you can play rook f8, put more pressure. You can even eventually play slow moves, depending on what white does. If white rushes you, plays h3, obviously after take, take, and take, take, here you may argue that white can play king g2 and defend the pawn, so you're not going to be able to take it. Let's say rook f8, king g2. However, you play knight g6, and after rook a to d1, there's not much else that our opponent can do. King e7, and now we're going to go with a4. What if white plays, let's say, rook f to e1, to make an example? Here you play, the plan is like this. Rook to f6. You got to double up, right? So rook to e3 to put more defense over that pawn. However, knight f3, knight f4 check, king g3, rook to g6, and you're completely winning, as you can tell. So instead of rook to f to e1, in this position, what if a4? This is just an indicative move, just to see how we're going to take the game, because there is absolutely nothing that our opponent can do. Can't push the h pawn, can't push the f pawn. They will be taken c4 or a4. They don't do anything. c4 is even worse, I think. Or moving the rook, but you're still going to play the knight moves. So knight h4 check, king to g3, rook to f4, protecting the knight. And now it's inevitable. Rook to d3 to protect the weak pawn, because obviously we're going to play g5 to support the knight, and then we can take this pawn. So white has to do something. Rook a to f8, putting more attack over that pawn. Rook to e1 with the idea of going to e3 just doesn't work. You're going to play knight to f3, and you can take it from here. So back in this position after d6, what if instead of bishop d5, white plays a4? The idea is that if we play knight a5, which is a thematic move, we are interested in playing bishop g4 to pin this knight and then smash the pawn structure. And one of the moves you can play is knight to a5 to trade with this important bishop, or force the bishop to e2, but then you can carry on. You can watch the other videos to have everything clear. After a4, you already played bishop g4. So after bishop e2, right, it looks like now the bishop is securing the safety of this knight here in f3. What to do? Castle, h3, and now bishop e6. It doesn't make any sense to take the knight. So rook to b1. Remember that the weakness here has been created. That was our goal. d6 calms everything down. Our opponent doesn't have anything. Knight to d2. How to react to this move? King to h8. Let's see a few options now. Let's say if, for example, knight to c4, right? Simply queen to g6. You are now attacking the square h3. So if, by the way, if king moves to h2, you can take the free pawn in e4. So this is a fork. If the knight goes to e3 to go maybe to these two good-looking squares, for instance, remember you have an attack on h3, and there was nothing to do to stop it. So instead of knight c4, let's look at bishop to c4. Okay, bishop to d7. This is why we have to play king h8. We needed to avoid that trade. Knight d2 plan with bishop c4 to eliminate our very strong bishop is really important. So bishop to b5 now, pinning our knight. a6, attack the bishop. He has to do something about it. So after take, take. Now, if queen goes to e2 to protect this pawn, together with the knight, you're just going to win the pawn in a4. If instead our opponent plays knight to c4, just to make an example, you will just play here. There's no, you're threatening here. There's nothing. So the knight even, the idea of going to e3 is completely pointless. So let's take it from the start. Okay, so the d3 variation with knight f6 now. Bishop g5, h6. And we're looking at take, knight c3, and bishop to b4. This is important. Pay attention. You might wonder, what about queen to d2? Doesn't that stop our opponent from, losing getting the ugly pawn structures? Because now if we take, white can take back with the queen. Yes, that's true. That is more solid, and that does save white from that problem, but it creates another problem for the white player. That is that the queen is no longer on the diagonal of this knight, and it's weak. So how to continue now? You play d6. And after a3 attacking the knight, you just take it. Now, if white takes, obviously you take, and that's like a transposition, and you've created, you got what you wanted. If queen takes back to safeguard the safety, the integrity of this pawn structure, then rook to f8, we're threatening to simply, take, and then bishop g4, and the knight can't move because the queen has gone away from the defense of this f2 square. She's not in e2 or defending the knight, so we are making a lot of threats. So obviously at this point, white takes here in f5. Okay, take back the bishop, and after long castle, to avoid all of the problems, long castle as well. And so this move here of queen d2 and queen c3, yes, did manage to save black from the weakness that it was going to get, but it lost tempos. And now if white wants to start pushing pawns, white shouldn't have castled short side. Let's make an example. Let's go back and move. If white does castle short, we're gonna castle long side. And here, if you think that white can now play b4, this is obviously not working. You're gonna play d5. And when the bishop moves, you play bishop to g4. And this is a problem because now that white is castle short side, we're going to take here. And obviously this gets very easy to win. Now, obviously, you might argue, what if the knight moves? Doesn't allow you to take. Well, now you can play knight to d4. You're threatening this. It's completely winning. And so instead of that, instead of knight to d2, now, what if white first takes our knight here so that our knight cannot really damage anymore, but now you can take in f3. This is really important. Now you go still an attack on this bishop. There are no divisions, except bishop takes, king takes, but then white doesn't have a check, and the bishop can't even retreat anywhere, because if the bishop moves away, then you got queen g. The queen is infiltrating. It's creating this attack, pinning the pawn, and creating the weakness. G3 isn't really a thing. You're just gonna easily go and checkmate. So here, you might argue, okay, take, king takes, and now pawn takes back. Look how horribly placed the white pieces. You're gonna take here, and you're stopping the king from moving. The pawn cannot move to help, to get the queen to help, because then, the pawn is pinned. And you got very simple ideas like this and this, or this and this, whatever. So back in this position, long castle. And now you're threatening bishop g4, which simply pins the knight, and then you should be able to add more pressure on the knight and then take and win material easily. The h3 pawn move doesn't work, because if h3 you play bishop to g6 with the idea of doing the same thing from the square h5. g4, obviously, then you can take here. White is ruining the pawn structure. You're also going to go to f2 afterwards. So you might argue, okay, what about rook to e1 to get it out of the pin? But still, you do this anyway, because then when the knight moves, you go into f2. So what about rook to f1? Then you do this anyway. And then when the knight moves, you can play d5. And when the bishop goes to a2, you can play bishop e2, and now you're attacking the rook has to move, and then you can take in f2, you're completely winning. If instead of bishop e2, the bishop goes to b5, now the best move is knight to d4, attacking the bishop and threatening this move as well, also completely winning position. But look, there's so much stuff and so many things that can happen. Obviously, at the end of this entire saga, including these extras, you should be mastering the Rousseau Gambit and beat every Italian player. So Bishop to g5 now, h6. What if they go back to e3? Basically, they realize that they don't want to trade, they don't want to go back, obviously, because then the bishop gets trapped. d6, castle, and now f4. The bishop has to move. Bishop to d2, g5. And yeah, that's how you play it. Knight to c3, developing. Bishop to g7. Let's look at this idea, because obviously you know what you're threatening here. You're just going to play the queen move, you know, the bishop move, and so on, and you castle alongside, and you keep storming these pawns like this, right? So castle opposite side. Let's look at this idea, knight to d5. In order to reduce our initiative, try and look for swaps. Okay, fine, we give it to them. And now there's two ways to take back. If pawn takes with an attack on the knight, you don't know how to continuously play. Knight e7, rook to e1, g4, and that's it. This knight can't move anywhere. Like knight to h4, but then bishop to f6, and now you understand why the knight in e7 is very well placed. It's attacking g6. This knight can't be defended. I mean, it has to be defended like that. It's the only way. But now you take, and knight to f5 now. The game will play itself. So in this position, bishop takes instead of pawn takes. What about this? Okay, g4. Carry on with the attack. Knight h4 is not even possible. So knight e1, h5. Let's look at this move now. c3. Queen to f6. Knight to c2. Knight to e7. Attacking the bishop. The bishop will have to go, so bishop to b3. Bishop to d7, continuing development, d4, now the knight. The c3 move was there to support the point d4, the knight, and to allow knight to c2 to support d4. White can strike the center, but now you castle long. Black has been completely winning the whole game. By the way, obviously, a swap here will just favor the black player, because then we got the bishop will be moving away, the rook will be on the open file of the same file of the queen, and these 3 pawns are going to destroy the king. If d5 to close the center, then queen to g6, attacking this pawn, but also threatening f3 and the pawn's moves. This should be game over very soon. By the way, something that needs to be seen, I've encountered it a few times, so it has to be seen, is that here after d3, knight f6, what if c3 by white? It gives you a pawn, so basically you got a free pawn here in e4, but it's kind of a tricky move. You gotta be careful, because okay, yeah, you do have to take the pawn. Pawn takes back, and now knight takes. So now there's a lot of ideas, like queen to d5 is the most popular move here. The idea is to checkmate you and to attack the knight. Looks like a fork, but it can be stopped with knight to d6. And that's it. White's got absolutely nothing. If white plays knight to g5 to increase the attack on the square f7, then you just play queen f6. Then after swapping with this bishop, you can just simplify. I mean, you're winning, and you'll see what happens when the bishop goes back. Yeah, let me make another example. Instead of knight g5, what about bishop to g5, attacking the queen? Here you just play bishop e7, and you're gonna swap. You're gonna forcefully swap everything, and again, you're completely winning position. If you look at the engine, you're out of every trouble. You're up a pawn, and white's got nothing. What if after knight to d6? What if the bishop here goes back, bishop to b3? Okay, again, queen to f6, right? So like it's called like almost like a transposition from before. Bishop goes to b3, but now you just play. Okay, well, white to move, so bishop to g5 now, very aggressive. Queen to f7, and you're forcing the trades of everything, and you take it to a very comfortable endgame. Queen to d2, moving away, releasing an attack on the queen. Queen to h5, castle, h6, attacking the bishop. Bishop to e3, b6. Knight to a3, developing. Bishop to a6, attacking the rook. Rook e1. Castle. Bear in mind that the position is evaluated around -4. This is not just a free pawn that we have. This is just a completely advantageous position because white overextended, went too far with the attack too prematurely. c4 by white, with the idea of c5, obviously, doesn't work. You just play knight to f5 and you're completely winning position. Also threatening bishop to d4. You got an attack on the bishop. You got to be pushing the pawns. g5, g4 as well. There's nothing for our opponent. So in this position, after knight to d6 just played to protect f7 checkmate square, Instead of bishop e3, what if knight takes in e5? This is a crazy line, right? So you play queen to e7, and you're pinning the knight. A move like f4 now to protect it, you're just taking c4, and you're just gonna trade everything, and you're up material and up positions. Everything is so much better. Instead of f4, what about castle? This, but you gotta do it. This is the move. Take. If queen takes, knight takes, then rook e1. Remember, you got this attack on the bishop. You totally didn't see that, did you? So let's go back. Here, after queen takes e5, the last attempt of our opponent to justify this stupid opening he played is queen to d1. The idea of rook e1 winning for white. Okay, bishop e7, I'm pinning the queen. Bishop e3, saving the bishop. b3. Rook e1, attacking the queen. Queen to f6. You see how everything turns the same. Knight d2 with the idea of knight f3. This is completely game over. Anyway, we're completely winning. Let's just see a few more moves to close the line. Bishop to b7, knight to f3, long castle, all very similar to usual. Bishop to g5, a lot of attack over the bishop, but you play queen to f8. You're completely winning. You're up a piece, and that sacrifice didn't work. Let's look now at 3 lines that for some reason they're not in the chapter. I mean, I was going to, but like this is why I'm making these extra videos for, because I rewatch my own videos to understand more and more and learn these lines myself, right? Obviously, sometimes I notice that a line that is actually a crucial one is missing, so then I take care of doing it in the extra videos. So here after f5, let's look at this variation now. When the pawn takes in f5. Now, as we know from one of the previous videos, I mean, I think the first video and some other videos, you play a4 with a very strong attack on the knight. Now, after queen to e2, I'm pinning the pawn, you play queen e7. And after knight to g1, we play the important knight f6, because you want to avoid queen h5 move. So knight f6, now there are 3 options that need to be seen. One of them is d3, with the attack on the pawn. This loses the game immediately. Black plays knight to d2, attacking knight to d4, attacking the queen. The queen will have to move. Whether d1 or d2 doesn't matter. Let's say d2, but you will either way take in c2. Check. The king has to move. I mean, if queen takes knight, then you can take this pawn with a discover check, and you're winning the queen, whatever the queen does. So king to d1, you win the rook. And now after knight f3, last attempt by white. Be careful, don't take this knight, because then rook e1 will pin your queen to the king. So here you just play d5 and you carry on, you take it from here. You should be able to recapture this point in f5 and then castle the king and so on. You're completely winning position. So back in this position, instead of d3, let's look at the other option, which is knight to c3 now. Okay, knight to d4, attacking the queen. Queen is forced to do d1, d5. And it looks like a free pawn, but after knight takes, you can now recapture in f5. And when you're gonna play e3, right? So let's say, for example, it's unstoppable. Besides, white is not developed at all, and you're gonna play long castle and so on. So if bishop takes the pawn here, rook b8, the bishop has to move again. Bishop a6 only square, but then you play a3 with the idea of a knight to c2. You're also threatening, to take here. It's game over. Everything wins at this point. And just a few moves ago, instead of bishop to b7, what about, you might wonder, bishop to b3? Looks like it's safe at all, but you can play queen to g5 with a threat on g2, and that's too strong. It just cannot be stopped. Even g2, it seems like it but it's just not doing anything, because you can simply play a bishop to g4, and position evaluated -5 for a reason. The queen is trapped. So the last option we're going to look at, let's take it from the start. It's always good to make recaps. Take knight, attack the knight, queen e2, queen e7, knight g1, knight f6. Instead of d3 or knight c3, what about knight h3? I've encountered this move. Here you do the same thing, knight d4, queen back to d1, d5. The bishop has to go, but let's look at this variation. The bishop goes to f1. So here now, after recapturing f5, how to continue here? Knight to c3 developing, Here you just take the knight, pawn takes back, and now knight f3 check. Only move is king e2, but then d4, the knight has to move. But wherever the knight goes, let's say knight to b5 for instance, but still queen to d7, and you're threatening not just the knight, but also d3 with a checkmate next move. Let's see some more stuff, and then we're gonna close this video. Bishop c4, f5, pawn takes e4. Okay, queen e2, queen e7, knight g1, knight f6, and now let's look at this move, c3, to stop any idea of the knight going to attack of the square c2. Okay, d5 attacks the bishop, bishop to b5, pinning our knight. Okay, fine, take this pawn, and now d4 by our opponent. How to take this? Okay, take en passant. Our opponent cannot take back, so that was completely stupid, so that means it's not going to work. Let's not look at this, but it kind of has to be seen, because you gotta see, I mean, d4 looks interesting, because after giving up the pawn and so on, you might think our opponent can recapture it, but at least he doesn't go that backward in development as he is now. But the thing is, it's impossible for our opponent to, he can't play d3 because we will just take it, and he can't play anything else. Let's make an example. Okay, well, first of all, let's see this line, right? d4, take en passant, right? And after take, our opponent can develop, knight f3, a6 attacks the bishop. Obviously taking this gives us this fantastic center. Knight to h4, attacking our bishop, removing the defender of this pawn so that our opponent can recapture it in the future. Bishop e4. Bishop a4, saving the bishop. h6, to allow a shelter for the bishop. Bishop to d1, g5, knight f3, g4, knight d4, take, and I just take the pawn in g2 as well. Our opponent doesn't manage to recapture that pawn. Let's go back a second here. Instead of d4, what about any other move? Let's say knight a3 development, right? Here you play queen to f7 to allow development of the bishop. This knight can't really go anywhere except c2, but you're going to play bishop c5 anyway, and you should be able to also castle, and position evaluated like -4, believe it or not. Let me show you what the plan is. If our opponent leaves things like that, right, just to make an example, bishop takes, pawn takes, and then short castle. This is what you want to do. So let's go back a second, and here now it's white to move. What if knight goes knight to c2, developing? Okay, bishop to d6, knight to d4, putting pressure on the knight. Okay, bishop to d7, and that's it. Again, position evaluated -4, because our opponent has no development and can't really develop anything. Not even a move like f3 here works to try and strike against this very strong center. Here now you would castle, and when white takes the pawn, you can play rook a to e8 and then just smash this king. Position evaluated -6. What else can you ask for? And even then, in this position, instead of f3, what about d3? Seems like now d3 is possible. We're no longer threatening to pin the opponent queen. So again, here you castle short. And when the pawn takes, it looks like this is the beginning of a normal game for our opponent. But remember the move knight f3, knight g1, penalizing our opponent. Knight to e4 is just too strong. You got too much attack over the square f2, and it just cannot be stopped. It's not like you get to play knight f3 to stop the access to the square f2. You will just play rook a to e8. Position evaluated -5. Let's look at something else. Man, I'm tired. So f5, pawn takes, e4. What if white doesn't play that move, queen e2, but rather just goes immediately to g1? Okay, d5. We have seen something like this in the past, and we know that after queen h5 we got nothing to worry. You'll play king e7, and then when the bishop saves itself by going to b3, you play knight f6 attacking the queen, and our opponents got absolutely nothing. So for more information, go and watch the video number 14 of the Italian saga. So here, after d5, instead of queen h5, which we have seen, we have not seen bishop back to e2, also threatening to play this annoying move. Here you play queen to g5. Now this move can no longer happen, because then after g6 and take, maybe you're attacking the bishop again, the bishop will have to move, and you are again attacking the square g2. So let's look at g3 straight away. Okay, queen to f5, and after d3, challenging our strong center, bishop to c5, threatening check in f2, deadly check. Bishop to e3 stops that from happening, but you can take, and now knight to h6 is the key move. So after pawn takes and pawn takes, knight to c3, looks like white might try to play a normal game. You play bishop to e6, very important move, because it prepares rook to d8 and the queen is trapped. So let's make an example. If queen to d2 to prepare long castle, rook d8 simply wins the game. So instead of that, what if bishop to b5, pinning the knight and allowing more freedom to the queen, short castle, queen e2, developing rook a to d8. Black is completely winning the whole game. h4 as a last desperate attempt of our opponent to play, because white wants to play knight h3, potentially go to f4, but he can't do it. So after h4 he might play knight h3 now, but then queen e5, attacking this weakness. This cannot be protected, because even if it gets protected, let's say queen g2, you play knight g4 with an attack on this square, and also preparing, you also knight f2 or rook to f2, it depends on how you want to play. Everything wins, so we're gonna leave it there.